Hello everybody, and welcome to the third talk in this series on Project Frank, which is an evangelism and discipleship project where the believers don't have to evangelize. The title of this particular talk is called Open Doors and How to Recognize Them. You know, God opens doors when we ask Him to. In Colossians 4 we read about Paul asking the believers to pray for us that God would open a door to us for the Word. And there are plenty of other references where people have asked for prayer for God to open up doors. Now, excuse me, you might say to me, well, I'm not Paul, the Apostle Paul, for God to open a door for me to Europe. And you're right, and neither am I. But can God not open up a small door for you as a priest to your Franks? Can God not do that? Of course He can, and He absolutely wants to do that because you are His priest for your neighbours and your work colleagues and so forth. We need to ask Him to open up a door. Let's look at this verse. In Matthew chapter 7, it says this, Jesus says this, "Ask and it will be given, seek and you will find, knock and it will be open to you." You hear what that plainly says? Knock and it will be open to you. I was probably a Christian less than a year when I read that verse and realized that God was making a promise here. If we knock, He will open a door. If I ask God to open up a door with some of my unsaved friends, God will open up a door. So that's the faith that we need to take in and pray, Lord, open a door for my Franks. Now remember, we're not having to evangelize, so we're just asking Him to open a door so we can befriend them and invite them to an outreach meeting later in the year. Now, here's the thing I would say again to churches where I do this course or groups of other believers. I will say this to them, look, if God doesn't open a door, then stay at home and relax. Now, that might sound, a bit comical perhaps, a bit cynical, I don't know. But the reality is, it's better doing that than trying to force open a door. Because usually we do this because we love the Lord. It's, from good motives. We feel we should be evangelizing. We care for people that are dying, and not going to heaven. And so we want to do something about it. So we try to open up a door because we feel this is how to serve the Lord. But if He hasn't opened up, we tend to blow the door. We'll say things that are out of place. We'll push somebody. We'll make them feel uncomfortable. And then we get no more further opportunity to talk to them about the Lord. So it's a question of waiting on God here for Him to open up the door. This is what we've been praying about earlier on. We've asked God to put on our hearts the ones He's already working in or wants to work in. And then we're praying for Him to open up a door and us to be led through the door, not to be doing this thing ourselves. So remember, you don't have to evangelize. You just have to befriend and invite. Now, if God opens a door with one of your Franks, then that's very encouraging. This is proof that God has opened up this door. God is leading you as His priest to minister in this door that He's opened up. It gives you confidence to go through the door and make the most of it. A bit like Gideon we saw earlier on, who considered himself to be the most ill-equipped believer in all of Israel. He was totally, in his mind, the weakest in his tribe, and his tribe was the weakest in Israel. So he felt he was totally ill-equipped for this, and yet God led him to do this wonderful work. So likewise with you, trusting God to open up the door, you can then have the confidence to go through it and not try to make it happen yourself. Now, obviously, if we're praying for God to open doors, we must recognize the doors that He opens. And there are three kinds of doors God will open. There's a practical door, a spiritual door, and an evangelistic door. I'm always encouraging the believers, if God opens up a practical door and you're starting to develop a friendship, begin to start to pray that God will open up a spiritual door. If He's opened up a spiritual door, pray that He opens up an evangelistic door, at least when it comes to the time of the mission. Let me explain what each of these doors are so we understand. So a practical door, sure, it's probably fairly obvious, but these will be things where your Frank has a practical need. So for instance, if somebody needs a lift to the hospital, perhaps their car's broken, and it's one of your Franks, you see that, you go and offer the help. Don't wait for them to come and ask you. but go and offer the help. Or perhaps somebody needing babysitting, or somebody helping with some material needs. There are so many practicals, but by far the most number of doors that will be open to you are practical doors. And listen, we're only making this commitment to go through these practical doors for our Franks. It doesn't mean we have to go and help absolutely everybody we see. It'd be wonderful if you do, but we don't want to burden ourselves here with things we can't cope with. But if God opens a practical door for our Franks, then we must go through it, because this is what we're praying for. Okay, second kind of doors, spiritual doors. Now this is when a Frank begins to open up their heart to you and starts to share some needs that they have within their soul. So perhaps they might share that they're feeling lonely, or perhaps they might have some problems in their family, or maybe they're struggling with some recently somebody has hurt them, or maybe it's a hurt from the past, or things like that. They begin to open up and share spiritual needs. Now, what's the first thing you should do here, apart from pray? What's the first thing you should do? Listen. And we can all do that. Here, you don't need any training, you don't need any equipping, you just need to keep your mouth shut. You just need to listen to what the person's saying. Don't interrupt them, don't give them advice, don't try to direct the conversation, just let them pour out. Maybe as the conversation goes on, maybe they will ask a question and you try the best you can to answer the question, but you don't have to do any more at this stage than listen. Now, usually these spiritual doors will open up after we have developed a relationship having gone through a practical door, but it's not always the case. Sometimes a spiritual door will open up with one of our Franks that we weren't expecting, or a spiritual door will open up with somebody who isn't on our Frank list. And this will happen every time we've done this project. It's always happened, and more than once. And it really is because there are so many believers gathered together and praying in a focused way for Franks to be opened up and brought to the Lord, and the Lord just opens up other doors as well. I suppose it's something to do with spiritual battles going on in heaven. But here's an example of one that happened some years ago. A couple of Christian friends of mine, husband and wife, I think it was a Saturday morning, and a neighbour knocked the door. The wife opened the door and vaguely recognised him. They weren't friends or anything, but she knew he was on the street, didn't know his name. And the neighbour said to her, "I just wanted to tell you that yesterday my wife died." Now, which kind of a door is that? I hope you would recognise straight away that that's a spiritual door. This is a man who's suffering grief and he wants to share it with somebody. Now, this couple, they weren't in the Frank project. They were taken by surprise. And the wife said, "Well, listen, here's the number of our pastor, if you need any help with anything." And she passed the number on and he went on home. What should we do, especially if we're in this Frank project? Invite that man in. Don't be frightened, don't be panicking, because all you have to do is listen. Invite him to come into the house, make a cup of tea, sit down, ask a question. Well, how are you feeling? Or whatever you feel would open the door, and let him pour out and speak. Probably he'll speak most of it about his wife, about the loss that he feels and so forth. Just trust that you are a priest of God in that situation, even if it's not a Frank, and that God is ministering through you just by listening. Like I say, if some questions do open up, trust that the Lord is giving you an answer for that question, but don't try to convert it into an evangelistic door, and don't try to answer questions that are not asked. Just love him. Listen and love. Okay, third kind of door is evangelistic doors, and this is when somebody is beginning to ask questions that are seeking questions. Now, this will usually happen with somebody that you've developed a friendship with, that you've already had perhaps spiritual conversations with them. They're beginning to find themselves opening up to God, being drawn to God, and they want to start to ask about how they can come into a relationship with God, but they don't really know what to ask. They're not in a place where they know the gospel. They're just beginning to want to find out more about God. So they might ask something like, does God answer prayer? Or perhaps they will say, is there a heaven? Is there a hell? These kind of questions. Now, whenever they ask that kind of question, you answer it as best you can, but don't answer a question they're not asking. Let the Lord lead it here. In other words, don't try to get to it too quickly. Don't try to open up something too quickly, because then you'll start to push a door. And as soon as they feel that you're starting to, they wouldn't even know the word, but as soon as they feel you're starting to press them or evangelize them, they'll close up and they may not open up again. So you've got to let God move here and just answer the question you're asking. If they don't answer any questions, don't send. You might say at the end, would you like me to pray for you? But even then, be careful with that. I want to give you an example. Again, this kind of thing can happen sometimes when it's not with a Frank. It's not a relationship that's being developed. It can just happen out of the blue. My wife, Mary, and I were moving back from Moldova to Northern Ireland. We got ourselves a house. We were wanting to change the central heating system to be a gas central heating system. So we'd invited different ones to quote, and one particular plumber stroke engineer came to our house to give us a quote. Now, I wasn't in the house at the time. Mary showed him around. He began to do all the notes. One of the things we will do, my wife would say probably that she's not an evangelist, but she does do the work of an evangelist. And one of the things that we often talk about to other believers when we're teaching about how to evangelize, this is a different course, we would talk about raising your flag. In other words, lifting up some kind of thing that will let the person you're talking to know a little bit about who you are, that you're a Christian in some kind of way. You're not blurting out, I'm a Christian, but you put up something that will give them the opportunity to go down that route in the conversation. So one of the things that Mary got into the conversation fairly quickly is that we were missionaries abroad. We'd been living in the Republic of Moldova, and now we would come back to Northern Ireland. Now, often when you do that kind of thing, somebody goes, oh no, a Christian, and they finish the conversation straight away, or they will go, oh dear, right, let's be polite, and they'll ask some polite questions and finish it quickly. Okay, don't try to force open the door, but sometimes they will ask a seeking question. And this man said, well, what exactly were you doing in Moldova? And she began to explain that we'd been sharing the gospel and so forth. And as he listened to it, he said, oh yes, I used to believe that when I was a Baptist. So that's where the conversation ended. Mary couldn't wait to ring me and tell me about this. Now, just a couple of things about that conversation. If this man at the end says, I used to be like that when I was a Baptist, what would you discern straight away from that, really? Well, he was a Baptist. What happened? That he isn't a Baptist anymore? The second thing is, if there's some bad experience or if he's turned away, he's still willing to talk about it. Otherwise, he wouldn't have opened up the opportunity for my wife to speak to him and ask him, well, what happened? So we knew already that God had opened up an evangelistic door here, and we couldn't wait for him to come back. In fact, he was the best price. So we brought him back to finalize giving the contract, and I was at home, of course. And after we'd finished off all the contract details and so forth, sat down to have a cup of tea. And I said to him, now I can be bold now because he said this. And I said to him, last time you were here, you were telling my wife, you used to be a Baptist. What happened? And he just opened up. And what happened it was probably an hour we were talking, he just kept asking questions. All I had to do was answer the questions, and I was explaining the whole gospel from start to finish. Now, at the end of it, I said to him, you understand these pretty well. Would you like to give your life to Christ? And he said, you sound just like my daughter. And my heart rejoiced because he had a daughter who was a believer who was already working with him. So in a sense, I didn't need to push or press anymore. And we stayed in contact, a few times I've talked to him when we've been doing the plumbing job. Isn't yet saved, but his daughter's working with him and praying for him. Okay, now, those are the things that can happen, when you're in this project and everybody's praying for the same thing. So here's what we need to do every day as you pray for your Franks. Lord, open up John and draw him to Christ. Pray this second prayer. Lord, open up a door for me to befriend John. Thank you.